The Russians' attempts to occupy Huliaipole in the Zaporizhia direction have failed. As stated by the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, all of the Russians' so-called grand plans are falling apart. Putin is puffing himself up like a balloon in front of the Americans, trying to show that he can do anything on the front lines. But the reality is different. The Russians are unable to break through the front, even though the fighting remains extremely intense. Russia's goal remains unchanged: the destruction of the Ukrainian state, but they won't succeed. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, on Telegram. Ukrainian soldiers are carrying out successful special operations in the Pokrovsk direction as well. During one of these operations, Special Operations Forces fighters eliminated several Russian occupiers at once who were trying to hide in the bushes. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine notes that the situation in the Pokrovsk sector remains difficult. Defenders repelled a quarter of all recorded attacks by occupying forces on this bridgehead.
The enemy's bogged down in urban combat for Pokrovsk and can't capture the city by force of arms. That's why they're trying to ramp up propaganda and disinformation, manipulate and fabricated stories about allegedly capturing Pokrovsk, both openly and covertly. The situation in our area of responsibility remains difficult. The enemy is actively assaulting the northern part of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian soldiers continue to carry out their tasks defending the city. From a message by the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Telegram.
The situation is also difficult in the Kostiantinovka and Nernoslobodzhanske-Alexandrovka directions. The defense forces are holding back the enemy's advance and destroying equipment and personnel. Island, the soldiers published a video of the destruction of a UAV command post that the Russians had set up in one of the buildings in the Vovchansk-Kharkiv region. The precise strike was carried out by Ukrainian aviation. Military experts note that the losses of the Russian army are simply colossal.
After all, lately the enemy has been using tactics of either human wave assaults or infantry tubes, or else using vehicles that are not suited for protecting personnel to move through the kill zone. Cars, motorcycles. Accordingly, the chances of survival for Russian assault troops moving through the kill zone in this way are very slim. The total losses of the Russian army for the month of November, just over 30,000. So accordingly, the ratio of wounded to killed among the Russians is simply catastrophic.
Just in the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 1,200 Russian occupiers. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russian army losses since the start of the full-scale war have already exceeded 1,176,000 military personnel. In addition, the day before, Ukrainian forces destroyed 6 Russian tanks, 3 armored combat vehicles, 16 artillery systems, and 3 multiple rocket launcher systems.
Joining our broadcast now is Alexei Heitman, retired major of the National Guard of Ukraine and military analyst. Alexei, good evening. We're glad to welcome you live on Freedom TV channel.
Hello.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Good evening.
Alexei, well, let's try to figure out what's happening on the various fronts. And of course, let's start with what's going on in Pokrovsk. We've informed our viewers about these different reports that have appeared today in both the Ukrainian and foreign press. As a result, the General Staff actually had to make a separate statement about what is really happening in Pokrovsk. According to your information, what is happening there now? In that direction?
Well, the General Staff, the commander directly, is strongly asking that all broadcasts debunk the myths of the Russian Federation, which have intensified and unfortunately are being supported. Even such, well, more or less. Although it's a tabloid, the German publication Bild, a tabloid, well, this isn't the first time they've published information that later, let's say, doesn't quite match reality. Part of the city, you could say, is controlled by the Russians. Well, you just mentioned that, along the railway in the northern part of the city. Part is controlled by our troops, and the main information, the key words, are probably that a sweep is underway, an attempt to clear out those groups that are infiltrating the city. We can't say that any part of the city is fully controlled, not even the southern or central parts are completely under Russian control. It's not a large force, just a small number of troops who have entered, and now they're there, they might be able to fortify themselves. It's possible to bring in everything necessary for combat operations there. These are groups that are slipping through. They're trying to concentrate there. This changes the situation a bit. It's not that troops have entered and are holding half the city, but rather that groups are infiltrating, slipping through our firing positions, through the front line, so to speak, and trying to concentrate there. But it looks a little different. And the information about, well, just between us. We've probably discussed this a dozen times already, maybe more. We've talked about whether we should trust the information when they write that there are only a few days, a few hours left before Pokrovsk is captured by the Russians. But these hours have already lasted several months, at the very least. In this situation, the Soviet spokesperson, the speaker, said that the situation is extremely difficult, but it is not, as described by the magazine Bild, and especially not as the Russian mass disinformation media portray it. We'll see how the situation develops. It's dynamic, but for 16 months now, the Russians have been trying to enter Pokrovsk, and so far they haven't succeeded. They have brought in their strategic or operational reserve there, at least their tactical reserve. That's about 50,000, so in total there were 150,000 there, give or take a few percent. Of course, it's clear that some people arrived, some left, some got sick. Roughly, there were 150,000, and then another 18,000 Marines were added, so that's 168,000. That's one way to count it. And out of those 150,000, 100 were on the front line and 50 were in reserve. Now those 50 have already been added directly to the front line, and out of those 150,000, about 70,000 are assault troops, specifically those who trained and prepared precisely for these kinds of assault operations. That's why the situation is extremely difficult. Russia isn't using, well, there's no new tactics. They're using one of the tactical options. In other words, besides attacks from the outside trying to capture the city, there are also these sabotage groups, small groups that infiltrate, and they too, well, they don't exactly give us peace of mind, and we have to divert some units directly from the front line in order to carry out what you could call counter-sabotage operations, to find and eliminate these groups. There are different estimates. From several dozen to several hundred of these people are present in Pokrovsk. That's a very significant number. Even if it's a few hundred, even if it's 500, we can't calculate the exact number, we can only make a rough analysis. Well, it's clear why we can't be exact. No one has counted them one by one or tracked exactly where they went in. But this isn't some large formation, not a big group or anything like that. It's not like there are several battalions, brigades, or regiments that have entered Pokrovsk and are now firmly in control. Some percentage of the city, like half for example, it looks completely different. These are groups we're fighting against, the ones we're defending from.
Here's another important point to note. The Russian occupiers, they've gotten bogged down in urban fighting for Pokrovsk. This is reported by the soldiers of the 7th Air Assault Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The enemy is trying to ramp up propaganda and disinformation, spread made-up stories about supposedly capturing the city. At the same time, the situation is not easy. The enemy is actively assaulting the northern part of Pokrovsk. That's exactly what we've been talking about. Ukrainian soldiers continue to carry out their tasks defending the city. In particular, they're expanding the logistics corridor. Also, despite the intense fighting, the defense forces in the Myrnohrad area have even managed to rotate some of their personnel. But still, Putin, when he's bored, keeps inviting journalists there over and over again. So the journalists arrive there. What threatens them, given that Russian troops have failed to capture it? Pokrovsk. So let Putin go there himself, to Kupensky, let him. Everything depends. If
It's also simple, yes, let not everyone doubt it.
Why do this? Who does it really affect? Or is all this in light of those geopolitical negotiations, the so-called peace talks everyone is discussing? This
affects the mood inside the Russian Federation. They need to believe that everything is going according to plan over there. Well, whether they believe it or not, that's another matter. In Russia, that's not really crucial. Whatever they're told, that's what they'll do. We can see that. But this is more pressure on us to make us start doubting whether we're being told the truth. There's this kind of information going around, making people start to not believe, to think that something is being hidden from us, that they don't want to tell us the truth. Come on, just tell the truth, no matter how bad it is. Well, Ian, it's pressure on us. And the pressure, of course, isn't really pressure, it's disinformation for, well, first and foremost, probably for the current American administration. The Europeans, they understand everything perfectly well. They see it all, they analyze everything. And Trump, well, if he didn't read the 28 points, as he says they proposed it, Vitkov agreed with Kirill Vitkov and Steve Dmitriev. They agreed, so let's go ahead and accept it. I think that when they tell him that, well, I was joking, of course, it's Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Vitkov, just a joke. Naturally, he doesn't look at the cards on the table, at how things really are on the battlefield. Gerasimov says, Putin says, Bild says, well, then that's how it is. That's probably what they're counting on. There's no need to try to convince him otherwise. You just need to suggest that the CIA provide operational information. After all, we use their intelligence data, but maybe they're hiding something. The CIA hides things from Trump, but not from us. If they're hiding things from Trump, then we need to ask what exactly they're hiding. After him, they'll tell us how Dio himself handled the circumstances. Because this kind of disinformation and these kinds of lies are already Goebbels-style propaganda tactics. We remember his positions, his ideas, that the bigger the lie, the more terrifying the lie, the more likely people are to believe it. Why is that? It's human psychology. We ourselves can't lie so brazenly, so deep down, we assume that other people can't lie like that either. That's why when we hear a monstrous lie, we think it must be true. In other words, they're operating according to Goebbels' principles. There's a lot that's very similar. That is, they've adopted all those programs, all those ideas that Goebbels tried to implement, and now they're actively using them. It's strange that people don't see this. Even professional diplomats in the United States, they should just take a look at what Dr. Goebbels wrote and what the Russian Federation's doing. They'll probably be unpleasantly surprised. You know, honestly, to send, or rather to dispatch the Russian dictator to Pokrovsk, or somewhere else really, he already has pretty much everything he needs for that. He has a fine fishing outfit, the kind he uses to accept lies and basically to spread this nonsense even further. As for Kupiansk, as for what's happening in the southern directions, so basically our commander-in-chief, Syrskyi, after working in the Kupiansk direction, announced that the clearing of the Kupiansk area from Russian occupiers is ongoing. These occupiers supposedly have some successes, but really only where? In their videos, in the business of propaganda. Now, as for the southern directions, Russian attempts to occupy Huliaipole in the Zaporizhia direction have completely failed. This was stated by Andrei Kovalenko, the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. He noted that all of the Russians' so-called grand plans are falling apart. Let's listen to the direct speech and discuss the details.
Putin is puffing himself up like a balloon in front of the Americans, trying to show that he can do anything on the front lines. But in reality, he is just groaning. The Russians are unable to break through the front, even though the fighting continues. The battles are indeed very tough. Russia's goal remains unchanged: the destruction of the state, Ukraine. But they won't succeed at anything. Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Alexei, what do you think about this endless, absolutely non-stop lying? It's just... In fact, I think maybe it hasn't even changed for some time now. The settlements they capture year after year, month after month, and still nothing comes of it. And what do you think? Is the target of all this lying now the domestic audience, or is it more for overseas? What do you think? Still, I have to say, I agree with Kovalenko here. It's still mostly aimed at the American audience. That's how they're trying to sell this bubble. You know, a person who is responsible for countering disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council should speak in, let's say, an officially dry language. And that's probably why it doesn't really resonate, it doesn't really touch the hearts of our citizens. maybe we need some kind of, I don't know, honestly, more informative approach. That's all correct. That's how it should be. Official information isn't delivered in poems or cartoons, it's presented in an officially dry language. But for us, who are discussing this information and saying the same things, I don't know, maybe we should pick something, maybe a song or something, so that it really touches people's hearts. Because here, people are starting to have doubts. I've heard more than once, and my friends have too, probably yours as well, that people are saying something is being hidden from us, that they don't want to tell us the truth. Well, here's a simple question. Why hide it? For what purpose? What's the goal? If, in any case, let's say it becomes, God forbid, if it becomes known that some situation is going to get worse, then why hide it? It'll become known anyway. So there's really no logic to it, but that's how it is. That's why dry information is perceived, but it's perceived by people who are at least somewhat professionally involved in this, or are trying to be. For people who just got home from work, they need some kind of information, at least that's how it seems to me, though I could be wrong. I whispered, of course, about a song, but it doesn't have to be a song or a cartoon, just something that makes it clear right away. What words should I choose? How should I present this information so that people immediately believe me? Well, maybe I should think about this more carefully, or maybe someone else could come up with something better than me. It might not sound very serious, but remember, back in the days of many, some kind of cataclysms, new ones, even wars, very often it was something that brought people together. For example, that same song, some patriotic song or some action, some kind of music. I think that's the way it should be. If information's easier to take in that way, then let it be easier. If it can reach someone, touch their soul, then probably we need to find, besides the official dry words, something that brings a smile or a tear so that it really resonates. Because doubting our armed forces, doubting our country during wartime, when there is such pressure, when it's a war of attrition, is unacceptable.
That's what the Russians do. They doubt their own country and their leadership, which lies to them. There's something else I'd like to point out.
They even came up with, even the Russians, it's amazing. There was this girl from St. Petersburg who sang a song, I think she's already in prison now, about the old man, something like that, sending people to their deaths. And that really stirred things up, since she was arrested for it. Maybe it had an impact on us too. Maybe there was something similar. I'll be honest, I can't sing. Well,
Let's leave that to the creative people. I'd also like to talk about the attacks on oil refineries. On the night of December 3rd, units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck an oil depot, the Dmitrievska facility in Russia's Tambov region. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. They emphasized that this facility supplied the needs of the Russian occupation forces. At the oil depot, several tanks containing petroleum products caught fire. Well, the results of the attack are, of course, still being clarified. In addition, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine noted that strikes were also carried out on other important facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation. And at the same time, continuing on the topic of propaganda, the Russian dictator talks about how he will close the Black Sea to Ukrainian ships and so on. And this is also in response to the fact that the so-called Shadow Fleet, which supposedly doesn't even exist but will take revenge for who knows what. How painful are the strikes on the oil refineries? And on the Shadow Fleet as well.
Well, regarding the Shadow Fleet, obviously 2 tankers won't change the overall strategy for the Shadow Fleet or for selling oil through it. But still, it's painful. It's more of an emotional blow than a real strike. Not enough to cause any serious damage, but in principle that too, it might even be more important. As for blocking our ships, well, we'll see. For now, we've driven out the Russian fleet, as assessed by... According to NATO and the Institute for the Study of War, the Institute for the Study of War says that the Russian Black Sea Fleet, despite losing almost a third of its strength, is still fulfilling its function as a naval force at about 15%, maybe a bit more. So with our so-called Mosquito fleet, we've managed to... The Russian fleet is just sitting quietly and not leaving their bays. If they want to block our fleet, what are they going to use to do it? Their own fleet? Well, let them sail out from Novorossiysk. I think they'll be sunk very quickly. Ready, go ahead, come out. Come out of hiding. Let's see how that ends for you. That's about the fleet. Now, about the oil refineries. Well, there are 3 pieces of news here. Good, bad, and good. I'll quickly tell you all 3 at once. The first good news is that if something is burning there in the tanks, until it burns out completely, it's impossible to put it out. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's actually pretty easy to repair. It's not really that much damage. You can just repaint it, clean up the debris, and use them again. That's the bad news. And the third good news, to close the loop, is that you can set it on fire again.
That's true, Alexei. Here, you and I are in complete agreement, 100%.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.